Welcome to the Cold War Conversations live stream tonight. I am delighted to welcome Rob Forsyth, who was a commander of Polaris submarine Repulse and had a long career in the submarine service, a number of diesel submarines that he served on, which I'm sure we will be talking about tonight. But welcome, Rob, to a Cold War Conversations live stream.
Well, I'm privileged to be honest. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, the privilege is ours, Rob, without a doubt. So I'm just waiting for people to start joining here. But I think perhaps a good place to start, and one of the stories that intrigued me with you was your first posting to Auriga, which was a war posting, I think you told me.
Pretty quickly, yes. It was my first submarine, and I joined as the junior officer, fifth hand, green as grass, wet behind the ears, with responsibility, if I had any at all, watched very closely by the crew because they didn't know my competence yet. But I was nominally had to help out with the torpedo department. We joined, did our workup, and shortly after workup, the whole of the Cuban Missile Crisis started to evolve, in the midst of which, or very early on, we got an order to store for war and sail for war patrol. So here I was, only just over a year into the submarine service, putting torpedoes on board with live warheads, which was quite quite interesting, quite sobering, and off we sailed. We were one of many submarines sent off into the Atlantic to form a barrier and to detect and report any Russian submarines that were coming south from the Iceland-Faroes Gap down towards Cuba. It was an interesting time because I was actually courting my now wife at the time. And I think I failed to tell her, A, that we were sailing, and secondly, more importantly, I didn't tell her why. 60 years later, she'll find out tonight.
And I mean, at that age, I mean, what did you think about that? Because presumably, you know, did you ever think that you were going to go to war, or not
probably,
when you joined up?
No, I thought there was a high probability. You know, I was born just before the Second World War, grew up in the post-war period. We'd had the Korean War. And there was every expectation from the history of Europe that perhaps there would be another war in my lifetime. So it was a possibility, but it didn't. When you're young, you relish the adventure rather than sort of count the cost of the risk. So it was very exciting. I was more concerned about doing the job properly than I was worrying about what we were going to see. At the back of our heads, we knew that there was sort of a nuclear threat behind all this. But of course, ironically, we were sailing to the safest place, which was underwater in the middle of the Atlantic. So we'd be all right, Jack. But yes, the whole thing was an adventure. Didn't frighten us at all.
Right. And
having said which, the captain might have taken it more seriously than the most junior officer on board.
But then you progressed on to, well, your first command was a diesel boat, HMS Alliance. What was it like actually being in command? What difference did that make?
Oh, it's quite different. They talk about the loneliness of command, and in a submarine where you are very close to being closely watched by the crew, although you are very close to them, you are still the captain, you're still making decisions on your own. The most difficult thing is to make difficult decisions without showing that you're concerned, worried, or not quite sure what to do, because you're in such close company that it's important to always exhibit calm. But it is probably, I think, the ultimate professional challenge to drive a submarine with 70 people, to keep it safe and fit for its role, which is to fight in wartime, and was both exciting and satisfying in equal measure.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just asking people to post their questions on the chat. I can see we've got a number of people who've now joined the live stream now. So we do welcome your questions. You're listening to well, not me really. You're listening to Rob Forsyth, a former Polaris nuclear missile submarine commander who also served on diesel Royal Navy boats as well. So we've just been talking about his early career there. But I can see we've got Glenn from New Zealand who's joined us. And that's the only one I could identify from a country anyway. So they're coming from all over the world. But our first question actually is from Willemsma and asking, how did you experience the Falklands conflict?
I left the Navy at the time, and I was actually in Australia working for a civilian company called Aunty. And Invincible had Aunty equipment on board, and you may recall the Australians were contemplating purchasing an aircraft carrier. And we were in the closing stages of closing the deal for the whole ship, which we weren't doing. We were just doing the radar and computer systems. And about to sign a big contract to support it. And suddenly the deal fell through. The carrier disappeared off any horizon of ours, and the Falklands happened. So I watched it from a distance, knowing that actually a high proportion of the commanding officers were peers of mine, or slightly senior or slightly junior. A very large number of submariners. Of course, Sandy Woodward, who led the naval force, was an ex-submariner. And perhaps therein lies one of the reasons for success, because a bit like Nelson and his band of brothers, Sandy Woodward knew his band of brothers. And while they communicated by radio, there was also a certain amount of mental empathy, so they could interpret what he was saying quite well, which is important in war.
Yeah. No, indeed. So were they buying a new aircraft carrier or an existing British
one? Buying Invincible second-hand.
Oh, okay. Low mileage.
Low mileage, not very well used, but well run in.
Yeah. No, indeed. So, yeah, we've got people from Orkney now, Germany as well.
I could add a little bit to the story.
Yeah, go on.
I wasn't actually at the Falklands, but I was in Argentina on Ferranti Computer System Limited Business shortly before the war, because we had a contract to maintain radar systems on their ships. And we did a routine visit to the naval headquarters. And it was meant to be 5 days, but after 2 days, nobody really wanted to talk to us. And we said, I don't know what we've said wrong, but we're not really very welcome here. So we sort of did our business quite quickly and went home, to find, of course, that those ships that belonged to the Argentinian Navy had sailed from Portsmouth for the Falklands, and shortly after, war broke out.
Wow.
But it wasn't my fault, I promise.
Yeah. No. Okay, so I've got a question here from Nick, and it's in the movies, submariners evade detection by silent running. Is that real, or is it a film story?
No, absolutely real. Silent running, or ultra quiet as we called it, was when in a diesel boat you were on electric motors and turned off everything, every machine you didn't need to use. The crew were told to remain stationary. People were told not to use cutlery, eating their food, no films, card games, anything that made a noise. You just lay in your bunk and kept quiet, and reduced the submarine to being looking like a floating rock, really. And if you could put it on the bottom and be a rock, even better.
Right, and that was true of Polaris as well. You had to do silent running with that.
Yes, we did. By then, of course, noise reduction technique had become quite advanced. So all the machinery was mounted on rubber insulation pads and mats and any pipes that were connected to the hull, because the hull being sort of circular acts like a drum and radiates sound outwards. So if you had a pipe that was connected to the hull without any rubber insulation to isolate it, and you tapped on the pipe, it was like sending a clarion call through the ocean. So techniques for making the whole of the submarine quiet existed, but nonetheless, movement and activity was restricted in the ultra-quiet state.
Right. Which actually brings us on to quite an interesting subject that you sort of caused a minor Twitter storm when you mentioned the floppy magnets, the noise tracking tools. Can you describe those? Because I was fascinated by this.
Yeah, well, this is going back to Auriga, my first boat. We went to Canada for 2 years to act as a clockwork mouse and target for training Canadian forces and working with American forces. And somebody had the bright idea that the submarines were getting harder to detect. So one way, if you found them, to keep tracking them was to make them make a noise. So somebody had this bright idea of creating what they called a floppy magnet, which was a magnet with a little hinged device and a clapper. And the idea was they threw lots of these things out of an aircraft, and 2 or 3 of them would clamp onto the hull, and the magnets would hold them there. And as you move through the water, they would vibrate. It was a really good idea. And certainly you could track us, but it drove us absolutely mad inside the boat. So actually the biggest success was we might all become sort of mad through the noise. But when the exercise was finished, we surfaced to go home, took the magnets off, but couldn't locate 2 of them, which were hidden deep underneath the casing. By the time we got back to Halifax, we didn't think it was a good operation at all, and suggested that actually probably better to drop bombs and blow up the submarine in the first case rather than just hit it with magnets.
Yeah, it's amazing how...
I mean, an example of one surfaced on Twitter, didn't it?
Yeah.
I've forgotten who it was who posted it, but he had a video, an underwater video, I think an American video of the trials of these things.
Yeah, and I think somebody had bought one on eBay.
That's right.
It might have been eBay or somewhere had managed to get hold of one. It was amazing how such basic technology could be so effective.
But it summed up a lot of recollections by those of us who were at sea quite a long time ago.
Yeah, no, indeed. So if anybody wants to ask questions, just post them in the chat. I've already got a number of questions here for Rob, but do feel free to post any question about submarines. Rob will try and answer them if he knows the answer. But Rob also served on Polaris, which was Britain's nuclear deterrent. So if you've got any particular questions around that, then do post a question. But we've got a question from Andrew Vatter, who has said the US SSBN, so the US nuclear missile submarines, had orders after their missiles were launched to operate as giant SSNs, so as giant hunter-killer submarines. Was that the same for the Royal Navy, he's asking?
Yes, it would have been the case. It would have been more a matter of self-defense, because, of course, if and when you'd fired your missiles, you would have been a sitting target to hunt down, so self-defense. But I have to say that the size and speed and whole thing about the SSBNs would have made them a fairly poor SSN. So self-defense would have been the primary role. I think acting as an aggressive attack submarine might have been mandated, but we certainly would not have been as efficient as an SSN, if only through lack of practice.
Yeah.
Because we spent most of our time moving around at walking pace, keeping away from anything that looked dangerous. So we had very little aggressive operational experience.
Right. And how many torpedoes would a Polaris sub carry for that sort of for defensive operations?
18.
Okay. Now, another question is from Glenn Towler in New Zealand, who's one of our financial supporters as well. And the question is, which did you enjoy more, your time on diesel boats or nuclear boats?
That's quite difficult. The diesel boat, because it was the first, was probably the most exciting. By the time I got to nuclear submarines, I was far more experienced, and so there was less sort of surprise excitement, but much more professional pride and ability. It was bigger, stronger, faster, deeper, much more complex, and so stretched you to the limit. But actually, command was great. But the thing that really, really got me was being teacher for 2 years, which probably was more satisfying than being in command.
Right. So this was you being one of the teachers on the parachute course.
Yes.
Can you just explain to people what the parachute course was for those that don't know?
Well, it was a 6-month course for a judge capable of being in command to train them, first of all, in basic safety, operating a submarine, how to look after them safely and the crew and that sort of thing. Then to teach them attacking techniques to an advanced level. And at the end, to assess whether they had the capability to be both safe and aggressive in wartime to carry out the role they might be given, and to then qualify them. If they went up to it and they then failed parachute, which is a self-evident name, they then returned to general service. So you actually had the future. Normally, a course consisted of 6 officers, 2 a year. And so you had the future of, I had 2 years as teacher students. So the future of 24 people depended partly on their ability, but a lot on my skill in teaching and also assessment of personality.
Right. No, that's really. And what was the sort of attrition rate with that? What sort of percentage would fail that course?
I think up until not all that long ago, it was about 30%.
Wow.
It's interesting. People who came were extremely competent, and it was wrong to call them failed. Really, they shouldn't have been called failed. They just hadn't qualified for submarine command, which had. Doing it required particular capabilities, particularly mental spatial awareness that handle 2 or 3 complex situations in your head, both managing the submarine as a boat, ahead the surface picture of what's happening above you, and how to carry out the tactics and strategies to conduct an attack. Based on sometimes not all that strong information, and some people in their head, and some people found it difficult. It became difficult. At that point, safety started to be affected, and that's when you decided that they just weren't the right person for this particular job.
Right. Yeah. No, understood. Did you have? Because I've noticed some documentaries where there were international or other navies taking the parachute course. Were you also doing that as well? Yeah.
Dutch, Norwegian, German, the 3 main ones, but I think Swedish, American, Australia, there's a lot of Commonwealth.
Yeah. Okay, we've got some questions coming in thick and fast. Question from Robert Lee. Do you know of a good book out there on parachute? If you don't worry about it.
The best book is Ian Ballantyne's Hunter Killers, which has a whole chapter or 2 devoted to parachute, which being based on my experience. So it all, of course, is a brilliant account.
Absolutely. That's a good recommendation. Ian Ballantyne was one of our guests on the podcast. I think almost 2 years ago that might have been, and we did a lengthy interview about the Royal Navy submarine service during the Cold War. So do check out that episode. I can't quite remember the number, but if you search submarines, you will find it on our website. So various other questions I've got here. One of the questions was, did you ever notice being shadowed by a Soviet submarine?
No, not specifically. I shadowed quite a few, but I was never aware of being shadowed. So either they were very good, or our countermeasures to avoid being shadowed were very good.
Right.
I was never, as far as I'm aware, trailed by a Soviet submarine.
And when you were shadowing Soviet submarines, I mean, well, a lot of people have seen Hunt for Red October. Is the Crazy Ivan maneuver a true maneuver that the Soviet Navy did to see if they were being followed?
Absolutely. Submarine captains at sea who are grayer than they used to be, having survived the Crazy Ivan. I mean, what does know what a Crazy Ivan is?
Yeah, go on, explain
Well,
it.
a Crazy Ivan is quite simple. If you're following a submarine from several hundred yards out to 5 miles, but if you got close and the Russian thought that you were there, or he wanted to check that you were there, he would periodically do what's called clear stern arcs, when he'd alter course about 50 or 60 degrees so he could hear behind himself. But every now and then they would add an excitement to this by having cleared their stern arcs, do a rapid full turnaround at full speed and come straight back down the track that they had just left. And of course, if you were sitting right behind them, they'd move out of the way quite quickly. Took place.
Right. No, thanks for sharing that, Rob. So other questions we've got. Did you have the opportunity to talk with former Soviet submariners after the end of the Cold War?
No, I didn't. Quite a few did. In the broad terms, quite a few people both went to Russia, met people, had good friends, but met 2 Russian servicemen ever. One was in North Korea, which was a chance encounter, and he was in uniform, and it was the first time I'd seen a Soviet close up. Nose to nose. We didn't have time for much conversation. And I'm trying to think what the other occasion is a story. Am I allowed to tell bits?
Oh, absolutely. That's why you're here, Rob.
Right.
We want your stories.
HMS Alliance, as people may, the submarine museum at Gosport. Of course, it needs money to keep it going and renovate it. We were having a fundraising campaign with an expensive dinner on HMS Victory. Part of it have an auction of high value things and interesting things. Who'd been to the Falklands had donated his submarine badge mounted on a plinth. Now, I knew the auctioneer, Charlie Ross, who was doing the auction, which is why I was doing it, because I knew it and invited him. And he said, Rob, I don't think a little badge on a piece of wood, whether it's been in the Falklands or not, is going to make much money, but we'll give it the best we can do. Come the dinner, come the auction, come the badge, Charlie Ross asked for the bidding to open, and the first bid is £1,000. From one end of the gun deck in the dark, sort of by gun 63, down by gun 16, somebody else bid £2,000. It went for 10.
Wow.
So they invited there is a point to the story that involves Russia. They invited the winner to come up to the top table and to collect his dolphins from the bottom of a glass of rum, which is now the tradition for qualified submariners. He walked up, picked up the glass, tossed it back, gripped the dolphins in his teeth, took it out and said in fluent English with a strong Russian accent, I've always wanted to hold a British submariner in my teeth. Ex-Navy, ex-KGB, which is why he spoke good English.
Wow. Wow. That's a great story. We don't mind deviations like that, Rob, if they're going to be stories like that. We have got other questions. Question from Nick Bayer, who is another one of our financial supporters. What is the neatest, most interesting non-classified feature on a submarine you discovered whilst on the sub?
So I'm trying to
the sort of what was the most interesting or most clever non-classified feature that was on a submarine that you served on, that you came across, that you thought at the time, wow, that is absolutely amazing that it can do that, or you came across in training?
Right. Probably the sonar systems, and the other would be the film projector.
Why the film projector? I'm probably going to guess
I've
this.
never got my hands on a film projector in my life, but of course, in my day, films were the only form of entertainment. The Naval Film Club and great big canisters of films, and we all had to qualify to become film projectionists without interruption between reels. So I was just as proud of being qualified as a film projectionist as I was at being a submariner. The two things went together.
So
the sonar systems, underwater sonar systems, were amazing because surface ships had sonar, and I had come from the surface ships, but I'd had very little experience of the sonar. But submarine sonars were quite different because, of course, they could listen in the direction a noise was coming from, but you couldn't tell how far away it was. So you needed quite sophisticated techniques to try and work out where the target actually was without making a ping. Because, of course, if you made a ping, the target knew exactly where you were as well, which was not good news. So that to me was fascinating, and so much so that I, in fact, in my career, volunteered for and did the very first sonar course for submarine officers, which, because we didn't have our own sonar course, I was sent off for a year to do the surface ship anti-submarine course, which qualified me as a submariner, which was very interesting. And I then helped carry sonar forward in the submarine service. So I was lucky. A lot of times when in my career, when we were facing up with sort of blue on blue exercises with surface ships, I knew what they would do because I'd done the course.
You'd have the benefit of being on top of the water as well as under. Yeah. Okay, some other questions we've got here.
Talking about rum, are we allowed to have a glass?
You are definitely allowed to have a glass of rum.
There's no rum. A glass of good bread.
God, I'm on the water here. I thought I had to keep a clear head. I thought I had to keep a clear head.
Seriously, I'm a guest.
Andrew Long has asked well, it's not really a question, but he wants to know about the fabled letter of last resort. What can you tell us about that, Rob?
Well, the first thing is there wasn't one when I was at sea in Repulse. It came in afterwards. So what I can say now is there is a letter of last resort, which the Prime Minister writes, and in it he gives his personal instructions to the submarine captain as to what to do if the submarine captain thinks that the UK government has effectively been destroyed. And there he is at sea, what should he do? And there's really three options. One is to fire at the last targets he had. The second is to do nothing. And the third, I don't think it really is an option, is to decide who we'd like to fire a missile at. So that's what it's about. So it's a private instruction from the Prime Minister direct to the submarine captain.
Yeah, and it's probably unique in terms of an order being sent after the most probable death of somebody. You know, for an order like that to still be in place, even though the person who issued it is no longer alive.
Yes, it could be a voice from the dead. I mean,
Yeah.
we are the only nuclear power with that has that sort of thing. And some people would argue that a direct order from somebody who's dead post-event is illegal. Is it valid? And what's the point of firing anyway? The submarine captain at sea wouldn't have a clue really what's actually going on or what he was going to do. Is it a revenge attack? It's a very controversial.
Yeah, indeed. And hopefully, Thomas Rostrop, that will answer your questions about, what were you supposed to do after launching your weapons. So next question we've got, this is from Williams again. He says, I understand the Dutch took over the Perisher course for diesel subs after the British ceased using those boats. Is that correct, Rob?
Correct. Yes, still do.
Okay. Now, Martin Douglas has asked a question, and this I think we did cover on the podcast interview that I did with you. But he says that Rob described the start of a patrol dive carried out in the Clyde exercise area and the techniques employed to hide from a Soviet AGI. If you can tell listeners what an Soviet AGI is, and then go into the evasive action you took there.
Yes, an AGI is a gathering ship, which the Soviets had a lot of, which were really dressed up with lots of sophisticated communications and sonar, and some of them had a torpedo tube. They operated outside the cloud areas, north of Ireland, south of the Hebrides, in that sort of area, trying to intercept ships and the submarines, leaving the Clyde, heading out for deep water in the northwest approaches. On this particular occasion, and I should clarify here, I served as a lieutenant commander on Repulse, but I was a command qualified, and therefore was the standby captain if the captain went sick. And there were two occasions command, so I have had command of a Polaris, and then I was promoted commander. It's always, the terms always get confused at the end of my time. Anyway, we were heading out north of Ireland, past Rathlin Island, heading for deep water, when we spotted an intelligence gathering ship on the horizon, which closed us very fast, and clearly was trying. I wasn't just taking a passing interest from a distance. He wanted to get close, and he came extremely close and came in. So with an international signal and asked him, could we help him? But he declined to reply. We asked him what his intentions were, and he declined to reply. But he got closer, and he was sitting literally a cable or so, 100 yards or so behind us. And we were very close to the position we were going to die. At the time I was in command, because my captain had got a bad back, was horizontal on his bunk, hoping he would recover. And he delegated command, went down below and said, excuse me, sir, but we've got an AGI on our tail. And I think we need to do something about it. He said, well, you are in command. Here, you are in command. You make the decision. That's what you get paid for. Do what you think is best. So I said, I think I'm going to dive. He said, I'll. So we prepared the boat for diving. Very normally do it at Polaris boat. It took sort of, 10 minutes or so to settle underwater. But we got everything ready for a crash dive. Simply let water into the ballast tank so the AGI couldn't see that we were doing it. So we sort of trimmed ourselves down. I briefed the crew. We went to action station. Stayed on the bridge to the last minute, sent everybody down, did a quick look around, made the decision we're going to go, and shouted, dive the boat, shot down below, shut the hatch. And the control room where the officer of the watch carrying out orders had full dive on the planes. We got full ahead on the engine, on the reactor, the propeller, and we disappeared underwater at a speed rarely emulated by an SSBN. And as we went down and passed about 90 feet, which is safe depth against an AGI, his propellers went straight over the top of us.
Wow.
At that point, command was an exciting place.
Slight understatement there, Rob, I think. Yeah. But yeah, wow.
All had similar exciting experiences. I was not unique by any means.
No, and I have heard similar stories, particularly challenges with that. Is it the Malin Head AGI?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. He was going to interfere with us. He either wanted to stop us diving, or he wanted to try and the back end or do something. He was harassing us severely.
Yeah. Now, one of our listeners and also another financial supporter is Martin Douglas, who actually served on Resolution between 82 and 87 as a motor room EM. And he's just mentioned that the B&H reel-to-reel projector dining room, the dining room became the cinema, and a two-reeler was a long film and very popular. So I think he's just saying that obviously the projector was a very important part of the inventory on a submarine. So we've got some other questions. It's just going back to Perisher. This is from Alexander Vatter. It's how good were the officers of the different nations prepared for the Perisher course? He says he's heard some struggled because they lacked experience and preparation.
Yes, in my time, which is quite a long time ago, I had several Norwegians who operated quite small submarines, and they were being sent on Perisher too quickly. They hadn't had sufficient experience to be able to comfortable and develop this spatial awareness. So they just weren't experienced enough. So after we had a couple fail, we had to go to Norway and talk to them and suggest they had longer at sea and another appointment and more experience before they came on Perisher, which I think happened and resolved. In general, and Canadian who operated boats very similar to our own, with similar Atlantic experience, or South Pacific if you're in Australia. Build up to Perisher was very similar, so they had no higher or lower failure rates in general than the RN officers. Right.
Okay. No, thank you for that. And a question from Carsten Schulter. When the SSBN is on a mission, has the SSBN the ability to move at any time, or can deployment also be stationary? So are you moving all the time, or sometimes are you just stationary like that rock in the water that you described?
Well, I've never personally conducted a patrol at the bottom of Loch Fyne, but theoretically, I suppose it could be possible. But on patrol, we were always underway. They're quite big boats, and to try and remain stationary in an SSBN for a very long time is quite hard work and probably makes quite a lot of noise with pumps and waters to keep it neutrally buoyant. So 4 or 5 knots, a walking pace, which would make trimming and control fairly easy, was generally that was the quietest to be. And then we had intelligence that was fed to us by input from the Air Force, from the RAF, from their aircraft or other SSNs or ships, telling us threats that were in the area. Nobody knew where we were except ourselves and our operating authority, but we got all the intelligence. And so we would try and start moving away from a threat long before it could get anywhere close to us. But you don't move very fast at 4 knots, particularly if you're clearing your stern arcs every now and then to check there's nobody behind you. So generally we kept moving.
Right.
The only time we were stationed was in a pre-launch, where we were about to launch missiles, which of course we exercised probably every week or 10 days. And the submarine had to be static, horizontally and vertically, because the missiles, the body of a missile is actually quite thin. So it doesn't have much lateral strength, like a break it quite easily. So the submarine must have no headway or sternway when a missile comes out of the tube. So we had a hover system which could grab the trim and make you stationary by pumping water in and out of the submarine under an automatic control very quickly. But it made a lot of noise. And as you were about to fire 60 missiles, a bit of noise here or there was neither here nor there.
Yeah. No, incredible. Because Martin also mentioned about because he participated in a Daso, a DASO. What's a DASO?
Demonstration and shakedown operation carried out at Cape Canaveral by every submarine on first commissioning, every boat on first commissioning, and probably once or twice thereafter to prove missile launch actually on the range to fire the missile down to the South Atlantic, which was always carried out at Florida because the Americans have the tracking capability.
Yeah. I thought we launched one a while back, wasn't it? And it went a little bit adrift,
yes.
I think.
Well, ours did. When we fired ours, it launched from the submarine quite successfully. Flight initiated, and the first stage started to fire, and then it veered off course. And so the destruct button, but everyone has a destruct capability, the destruct button was hit, and the missile was destroyed before it could go anywhere it shouldn't.
Yeah.
But they judged our launch had been a successful launch, so the submarine had carried out its part correctly, and they subsequently found there was a servo motor oil fed or something in one of the directional boost jets, which wasn't working properly.
Right. Martin's got another question. He wants you to, he said, as a Jimmy EXO executive officer, could Rob talk about the interface between the remoteness of the skipper and the crew? The Jimmy was the day-to-day senior officer that the crew were exposed to.
Yes, I like the phrase exposed to. That doesn't necessarily imply a good relationship. Quite right. The captain on a submarine tends to be a bit on his own. Yeah. And the first lieutenant EXO, Jimmy, has the job of keeping the crew fully in the picture, running the day-to-day life of the submarine, particularly responsible for morale and behavior and things like that. Yeah. So certainly on an SSBN, long patrols, boredom is the biggest worry. So you would spend quite a lot of time thinking about innovative things to do to keep people interested. So it was a challenge, keeping people motivated and interested.
Yeah. Because I remember in the notes that you gave me when I interviewed you before, and I forgot to ask you this question, you put a fascinating thing about the Aunty Minsk syndrome. Can you just describe what that was about?
Yes, well, we never knew what the targets of our missiles were. It was probably for national security, but they actually said it was because of the Aunty Minsk syndrome, that if you had an aunt who lived in Minsk or Moscow or somewhere, then you might be reluctant actually to carry out your part of the firing procedure.
Right.
So it was you have to try. It was such a dreadful thing. You have to try and introduce some light-hearted something into it to make it seem less real.
Yeah. Because you talked to me when we did the podcast interview about that weight of, what the actual job, the end game of the job was supposed to be, and how you dealt with that, and an interesting conversation with your skipper about the conditions at which you may not launch, you may refuse to launch the weapons.
Yes. At that time, it was we were told and were led to believe that it was the policy that we were what's called a second strike weapon. We would only fire if the UK or NATO was attacked with nuclear weapons by the Soviets, or I suppose by the Chinese, but they didn't have weapons at the time, which we went to sea accepting that was our role. But before we went to sea, my captain, Tom Green, and I sat down to discuss this because it was something clearly he and I should be quite clear on. And we came in the discussion, it became apparent that both of us felt that while our role to be a second strike weapon to threaten retaliation, but hope we never would have to, was one thing. If we were ever invited to fire first as a first preemptive strike, we wouldn't wish to do that because we couldn't see how you could ever have sufficiently good intelligence to fire first and have Armageddon, because there were 300 megatons warheads sitting on the top of these missiles, a lot of them. So we didn't want to initiate a nuclear war. So we said it was part of the informal drill to check whether the UK was still functioning, sort of behind what's behind the letter of last resort. And of course, one of the tests is the radio from home, the BBC broadcasting as usual. And we said, if we got an order to fire, and actually there was no indication from the BBC or any other aspect that actually a nuclear attack was happening, then actually we might pause for thought and not fire as ordered immediately. In fact, we might phone home.
Yeah.
Now that was our position, and we know other people thought the same. And there were, of course, people who didn't want to fire at all, so they quietly asked not to be put in command or second in command of an SSBN.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because that sort of leads us on to a question asked by Nick, which is there a certain personality that makes a good submariner? Is there a consistent trait that you would look for in a good submariner?
Yes, it's a difficult one because they're all different. I mean, the thing that struck me about submariners, we're not a common herd. And spiky, strong personalities, yet at sea they all get on together. I think it's the ability to recognize that high professionalism can sit alongside conforming to a system. So in a submarine, there's much less 3 bags full, so I'll do what you tell me because you tell me you must. Much more, I'll do what you tell me because you know your job more than I do on this particular issue, and so I will obey you without question because we all depended on each other for safety. So I think high level of probably and recognizing that was necessary. So people who didn't try hard enough or didn't put their backs into it, or you felt when really taking the whole business of being underwater, which is essentially dangerous, seriously, then actually you didn't want them on board.
Right.
So that's
right.
But
no,
strong personality is highly professional, but the ability to fit in different circumstances and to be very flexible.
Yeah, because I think on a submarine you're trained in other people's roles, aren't you? In case you're in that compartment, let's say, and something happens or something like that. I think so. Yeah, that flexibility is obviously key there. Another question from Willemsma, which is, how did family members cope with staying behind at home while you were on patrol?
Well, you should be my wife, probably. They coped, I think, remarkably. There's a whole book and a film to be made about family life for sure in our day when communication was even less than it is now. Because we sailed off for 8, 10, 12 weeks where we were, what we were doing, or when we were coming back. On a couple of occasions, where we coming back, because things got tight and got submarines which got into trouble and didn't always come home when they were expected to. So I think the families became very self-sufficient, and certainly in my time, when wives, probably less working wives, much more involved at home, they formed very close-knit groups, and wives supported wives, and they learned and supported each other, really. The biggest time of stress, of course, was when we came home, because we'd come off having been 8 weeks at sea in a fairly well-ordered existence in which we knew what we were doing and where we were going, and everybody sort of fitted in like a well-organized ant-heap. And then you'd go home when you had children who wouldn't do what they were told, a dog that was probably completely untrained and out of control, and everything seemed to us to be fuzzy. And as we tried to get a grip on it, of course, the wife had got everything organized, and now the husband was coming back in a poor place to do it, but trying to resume his sort of parental role. And I think there was quite a lot of 24 hours, 48 hours, probably. It was quite difficult for it all settled down a bit.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard of some crew who sort of almost couldn't wait to get back to the boat, but obviously there was that comfort of a regulated and regular and a known environment. And like you said,
patrol happy, we called it. And to say to people, go home, pick up your responsibilities, because on board it was a nice, well-ordered existence. You face the outside world, which is not well-ordered.
Yeah, no, indeed. A question from Derek Francis. Were you ever forced to surface, perhaps as a result of some emergency on a submarine?
Yes. Do
you want to describe that one, Rob? Or two?
Yeah, well, it happened on the first boat, Auriga, when we were in the early days before the Cuban crisis. So it was between work and the crisis. We'd been into Londonderry for a weekend, quite a difficult place to get in and out of, and sailed on a probably slightly hungover, went out to sea, dived in an area in which many submarines have dived frequently. Periscope depth, the captain ordered 110 feet, and then when we went down, passing about 80 feet, there was the most enormous bang. The submarine lurched about 30 degrees to the side, and we clearly hit something very hard, and we surfaced. And I was junior officer, set up to the bridge, the wet and the rain, while they tried to sort out what had happened. The submarine was intact. We hadn't ruptured. We went straight back home, put it to dock, and we'd ripped about 15 feet off the bilge keel. And we'd actually dived in an area subsequently found to have a lot of pinnacles up from the bottom. And by chance, nobody had ever really hit them before. But when they did a side scan survey of the area before Polaris submarines first went to sea, they discovered this pinnacle bed, which we had discovered.
Wow. Okay, so a question from Carsten Schulter. Was the patrol area in range of the possible target of Polaris missiles, or did you move closer, i.e. less warning time, for the target in times of higher tensions? What would you have done in times of higher tensions? Or was it just a question of launching from wherever you were in your patrol?
Yes, the whole point of the patrol was, in Polaris days, to be at 15 minutes notice at all times, to maintain constant communications, to be told if you should fire, and to remain at all times. Those are the three patrol aims.
Right.
So you had to be able to fire from where you were.
Right. Okay. Understood. Mike Chapman wants to know, do you have any interesting souvenirs from your time in the submarine service?
Yes, yeah, but hanging by our back is a bronze bell with HMS Auriga inscribed on it, which is the bell she had when she commissioned in 1944.
Wow.
Well, it was my first boat. I was married, serving on it, and our first child born on it. And when I found it was for sale, I purchased it. And it's now hanging, to the delight of my grandchildren, by the back door to be run on every possible occasion.
Wow. Wow. Is it really loud then, if they ring
Really
it?
big. It's a big bronze bell.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. That's a great souvenir. A question from Steve: which of the non-Royal Navy parachute candidates were the best?
Well, I could lose a lot of friends here because I have friends.
Well, no, you don't. You don't have to. You don't have to answer that one if we don't want you getting into trouble.
No, I wouldn't be with you. So I would say that all the parishes I passed were all very good.
That's the.
And I'm pleased to say none of them come back to haunt me.
Yeah. A question from Mark Vegas. The mental stress as a submariner must have been a constant challenge. How was this handled whilst on duty? How did you look after your mental health on duty?
Well, I hate to say it, but we gave no attention to it at all. A lot of people were non-volunteers. We certainly didn't get enough volunteers to man all the boats. So some of it was everybody on the right, submarines, everybody on the left, surface ships. So we took in a lot of people who didn't want to do it, and they all thought they get claustrophobia, but none of them did. I only knew one person in 23 years who got claustrophobia. There must have been others, but only one I knew of. And I don't think we did anything particular for mental health beyond keeping people stimulated, active, professionally trained, and occupied, which I suppose is a form of mental health management. But we did once in Canada, I remember a psychiatrist came on board because the Canadians hadn't got their own submarines and were about to get them. They came down to do a sort of survey of what makes a good submariner. They cut the survey short and went off saying to themselves, they're mad, all mad, all mad. And the gangway trot sentry, hearing him go off saying this, said, yes, sir, yeah, that's what they're all selected for. Unless they're mad, they can't become a submariner. And there's sort of, a little bit of ironic truth probably in that. You have to be unconventional, I think, to some extent.
Yeah, because I seem to, I can't remember where I read it somewhere, but there was a, life aboard a submarine in terms of how you worked with your officers or how you dealt with your officers was completely different to life on board a surface ship.
Yes, well, I like to think so, because I was looking at it from officer down. Some of the sailors looking up might not see it that way, but I think probably we all thought the same. We were all of one company. If we went for a run ashore, everybody made sure you all got back, whether you were officer or man, and there was a structured informality which you don't get on surface ships. In fact, I became a submariner, not because I was a volunteer, but my captain on a frigate, which I was on before I became a submariner, had me in one day and said, look, Forsyth, I think your slightly relaxed approach to discipline might do better in the submarines. And he sent me off to do the submarine course because he recognized that I didn't like the formality of surface ships and then the distance between people. And I like to be more purposeful, but I don't know, it was hard to describe. But he recognized something in me quite correctly, which better in the submarines than on a ship.
Right. Right.
And I think a lot of submariners are the same.
Yeah. Yeah. So if anybody's got any last questions, we're sort of coming up to the hour now, but we've probably got the time for one or two other questions. So if anybody has anything else they want to ask, feel free. But is there anything else you'd want to add, Rob, that we've not covered?
No, we probably don't have time to cover the subject that you might think I might want to cover, so I won't.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a bit odd of me to say that, but it is a fact that in my later years, I have now decided that actually the country can neither afford nor need Trident, that it's costing so much, £200 billion over 30 years. That it's actually denying us the conventional forces that at a time like this we would like to have but haven't got.
Yeah.
Our aircraft carrier deployed to the Far East and we had to be lent frigates to escort it speaks wonders. And I remember Nelson, who said, if I should die, you'll find want of frigates engraved on my heart. Well, I would add, and submarines. And that's money. And we spend a fortune on Trident. We don't win wars with nuclear weapons.
No.
We need conventional, and we haven't got enough.
Yeah, and Rob talks at length about that on the episode that I did with him, which I'll add to the notes on this when this goes up on YouTube as well. Got a couple of quick questions, Rob, before we finish. Martin is asking if you'd left Repulse before they took part in the DSRV Avalon rescue vessel exercise.
Yes, I had.
Right. Okay, because this was a dummy rescue from a sunk Repulse, apparently.
That's right, and volunteers were rescued from her, but I'd gone by then.
Right, okay. And a question from Derek Francis. Have you ever been on a Soviet submarine?
Yes. In Alexandria, in Egypt.
Right, and how did you find it?
I'd left the Navy at the time. How did I find it? Very small, somewhat cramped, bit even more old-fashioned than my first A boat, and I was not impressed.
Right. Yeah. I've been on a Foxtrot class, and yeah, that was pretty cramped as well. But I couldn't imagine, being on the surface in the Bay of Biscay in it or something like that. I mean, that's just beyond my comprehension. And this will be our last question. What lesson would you want the new generation to learn from the Cold War? That's quite a big question, that, actually. But
more submarines, more 7 SSNs is not enough. With 7 SSNs, we always will have 1, possibly 2 submarines available. An aircraft carrier group or 2 aircraft carrier groups requiring an SSN to escort them, all it requires is 1 or 2 carriers at sea, and we've got nothing to patrol the North Atlantic. And I question whether actually we should have put all our submarines. There is a role to play for conventional submarines. We need at least a dozen, preferably about 16 or 18 submarines, to be able to patrol the sea lanes on which we depend for the majority.
Yeah. Well, there's loads of people thanking you for your time on here, Rob. It's been a really insightful chat with you. I can see that the viewers have found it really interesting, and I'm really grateful that you carved out some time to have a chat with us. It was great fun talking to you, as always. It's always been. Being able to talk about some of you love is obviously a privilege. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. So we're going to close the live stream now. Thank you all for your questions. If you're not already a listener to Cold War Conversations, just search for us on your podcast app or subscribe to this channel, as well as all of our episodes get published to YouTube as well as to podcast apps. But thank you, everyone, for coming along. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening.